The iron chair stands as a mute witness to centuries of stillness. Its surface, now darkened with the burnished marks of time, holds within it a history that has slipped through the cracks of memory. Perhaps it was never meant to be understood, only endured. What if the silence around it, faint but ever present, was the real torment? Not because the fire was cruel, but because the fire was eternal, unrelenting. And what if that fire had a purpose, long since forgotten by us, but still flickering quietly beneath the surface, waiting to whisper its secrets? We are drawn to its unbroken stillness, the quiet of the metal, which speaks louder than any scream. Beneath its cold iron, where heat once roared, a strange sort of peace now dwells. Time has eroded much, but the chair, like the earth itself, remembers. The metal tells of a kind of permanence, a stain that never truly fades. The very stone and dust around it seem to lean in, waiting for a story that only the earth knows. And yet, we can never truly hear it. We only feel the weight of it, the absence, a memory so deep that it has slipped beneath the threshold of human understanding. What if this chair was never just a tool of torture, but a symbol, one that carried with it a profound connection to something older? Maybe it wasn't just the victims who were burned, but the very idea of forgetting, of erasing the people and their lives. What if the chair's design was not merely for suffering, but for silence, an ancient echo waiting to be swallowed by time? Could the chair be a product of a civilization lost? Not because it was buried by sand, but because it had outlived its purpose, slipping into the shadow of time's grasp. The chair was crafted by hands that have long crumbled to dust, perhaps even by a people whose memory has been erased by the very silence it now embodies. Could it be that the chair itself holds a key to a world so lost it remains untouchable? A world that slipped beneath the Earth's shifting tectonic plates, its secrets swallowed by the relentless push and pull of the planet? Or maybe not. Maybe the chair is just another fragment of the Earth's constant hum, a hum we cannot fully hear. And if this much has vanished, what else are we still walking over? And as we move beneath this cold, rusted throne, we begin to wonder, could the Earth, in its quiet hum, keep the echoes of those lost beneath it? The bones, shattered, weathered, broken, are there still, beneath the stone and metal, awaiting the time when the land will once again uncover them. Maybe their voices have faded, but maybe not. Maybe, deep in the earth, their final cries were buried in the softest soil, whispers caught between the atoms of the ground itself. We walk upon this soil, unaware of the whispers that lie beneath our feet. Time has scattered the remains, eroded the sharp edges of their bones, but in the silent shift of the earth's plates, could we be walking over the last traces of their existence? The remnants of a people, suspended between the worlds of dust and memory, are pressed gently into the strata, compressed beneath the weight of a world that has forgotten them. What if we could hear those voices again? What if the earth, in its unceasing passage of time, keeps more than just rocks and fossils? It holds within it the stories of lives lost and the things they left behind. The bones, now part of the landscape, may no longer speak in human language, but could the silence that surrounds them be their final message? The chair, a monument to cruelty, sits atop them like a marker, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. Could it be that in the erosion of their bones, their stories are not lost but reshaped, buried deep in the layers of soil, waiting for the moment when they might rise again? As each layer of dirt settles, each particle of earth slipping slowly into place, their voices might grow fainter, yes, but perhaps the very soil remembers. Maybe, beneath the chair, the bones are still alive in the way the wind whispers across the ruins, carrying the weight of lives once lived and now entombed in time. And as we ask ourselves these questions, we must wonder, what stories are being buried right now beneath our feet, waiting to be unearthed when time decides to speak once more? What if the metal itself has a memory, a whisper of time, stretching back farther than we can see? What if it is not just a man-made object, but something shaped by the hands of forces older than humanity itself, shaped by the pull of time and the slow, patient erosion of a world beyond our comprehension? Metal, like the earth, is constantly shifting, bending to the weight of years that pass without a sound. It rusts, decays, returns to the ground. And yet, Beneath this fading surface, could there be an imprint of time itself, a deep hunger for memory, a thirst that erases all but the most basic forms? The chair, with its crumbling edges, seems so simple, yet it is far from it. There is something in the way it deteriorates, the way the iron flakes off like the very skin of the earth being worn away, that suggests it is not just a tool of its makers, but an object shaped by time's own hunger. Every rusted corner, every inch of decayed metal, is not merely a result of neglect. It is the product of time's inexorable pull, a force so slow it seems still, but in truth, always turning, always eating away at the things we think are permanent. Could the chair itself be an artifact of an ancient force, a time before we understood entropy, before we learned to carve meaning into the objects we left behind? What if this chair, this simple device, was not forged by human hands, but shaped by the very forces of time, by the earth's slow exhale, by the stretching of continents, by the deep, quiet rumblings beneath our feet? What if the metal was pulled from the earth by forces we cannot even name, tempered not by human hands, but by the shifting of the tectonic plates, by the ebb and flow of the atmosphere, by the slow erosion of the very stone that surrounds it? Maybe the chair was meant to be forgotten. Maybe it was never meant to last. Not because its creators sought its destruction, but because time itself requires such things to decay. Maybe, just maybe, the chair was always meant to vanish, an object too simple, too imperfect for the memory of the world to hold on to. A thing to be returned to the dust, not through a grand cataclysm, but through the quiet erosion of every moment that has passed since it was created. Could this chair, this simple, decaying thing, be more than an instrument of pain? Could it be a reminder, not of the cruelty of humankind, but of the silence that surrounds us, of the things we forget as time moves through us, erasing everything we create, until even the memory of it fades into the ground? And if time can consume such things, what else has it already taken from us? What else are we walking over, unaware of the silent hunger beneath our feet? And what if, within this silent object, there was more than just memory? What if the chair was once the creation of hands not unlike ours, hands that shaped metal with a purpose we can no longer comprehend? These hands, long turned to dust, may have built something far more than a simple instrument. What if this chair was part of a grander design, a piece of a forgotten civilization whose very existence has faded, swallowed by the endless passage of time? We cannot know the names of the people who crafted this chair, but perhaps, in the curvature of its iron, in the cold precision of its design, there lies an imprint of their genius. The chair could be a trace, a whisper of a culture whose echoes have long since gone silent. Maybe their city, too, was swallowed by the earth, their temples buried under layers of dirt and stone. Maybe they, too, vanished without leaving a mark. The metal, now rusting away beneath our gaze, may have once been part of a technological marvel, far beyond what we understand today, a forgotten empire whose name was erased by time's cruel hand. What if they left behind more than just their tools and their devices? What if, in the dust that clings to the chair's surface, there is a memory, too, of their rise and fall? What if their knowledge, their advancements, were so great that even their technology became relics of a forgotten age? The earth holds many secrets, deep beneath its shifting surface, and maybe, just maybe, the chair is one of them. An artifact of a world that existed before ours, a civilization whose achievements were too fleeting to leave more than the faintest trace. The idea of vanished civilizations is not new. Whole cities have been erased by time, their names and deeds forgotten, their existence reduced to myths. And yet, what if we are surrounded by these forgotten worlds, their remnants buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered? What if the chair, with all its strange and unsettling simplicity, is a piece of that puzzle? What if it is not just an object, but a message, a clue left behind by those who understood time in ways we cannot yet imagine? And as we stand before this chair, its shadow stretching across the ground, we must wonder, how many more such traces are hidden beneath the earth? How much of the past remains out of reach, veiled by the slow erosion of ages? Maybe the secrets of lost worlds are not truly lost, only waiting, buried in the silence, for us to listen. What if the Earth is not just a place of life, but a graveyard of civilizations, each one leaving behind only fragments, each fragment a whisper in the wind? Perhaps the chair is not merely a chair, but a vessel of elemental memory, a vessel that carries the faint signatures of atoms older than the oldest stories. Somewhere within its rusted lattice, the iron may still hum with the echo of isotopes, unstable ghosts that have persisted through millennia, counting down with a rhythm that no human eye can see. Not because it demands attention, but because decay itself is patient, slow enough to slip beneath our perception, slow enough that it almost feels eternal. Imagine a carbon isotope, trapped in the metal, fading imperceptibly, leaving behind a trace of heat that is neither warmth nor cold, but the quiet pulse of time itself. The chair holds more than history. It holds half-lives, the measured surrender of matter to entropy, the slow slipping away of what once was. If we trace the chair's molecular skeleton, we might find iron forged in a world that no longer exists, smelted in furnaces whose smoke mingled with air denser and stranger than ours. Perhaps its atoms fell from the sky, or from deep within the earth, dragged up by tectonic convulsions and subduction zones, pressed into shape by hands long gone. Could it be that the very decay of isotopes is a kind of storytelling, a message written not in words, but in the soft erosion of matter over eons? And if so, who was meant to read it, if not the patient Earth itself, listening silently to the passing of its own memory? Time here is not linear, not because we cannot measure it, but because the chair, like all relics of vanished worlds, reminds us that chronology is a soft illusion. Half-lives bend our comprehension, stretching moments into millennia, folding years upon years into the silent echo of a single particle's decay. And what of the heat it leaves behind? Not a fire for the living, but a resonance, a warmth of being, a whisper that something once thrived here and then slipped quietly beneath the soil. Perhaps this chair was witness to rituals now lost, to fires that burned not for warmth, but for remembrance, for the careful tending of time itself. The isotopes in its bones may still remember those flames, the slow consumption of matter that transforms one form into another, leaving only shadowed traces for us to discover. We might consider that the chair contains a memory of extinction, a fossilized heartbeat of vanished civilizations, compressed into particles we cannot see, into energy we cannot touch, yet whose decay is inexorable and absolute. And yet, in that decay, there is renewal, for isotopes become something else, transmuted, reshaped, reincarnated in forms we cannot yet recognize. Could it be that even in silence, even in rust and corrosion, there is rebirth, a quiet recycling of the elements, a continuity that stretches beyond the fragile scaffold of human history? So we sit, or imagine sitting, before the chair, feeling the slow whisper of its elemental past, letting the half-life of its atoms seep into our own perception of time. We realize that decay is not absence, but transformation, that the chair's silence is not nothing, but a slow dialogue with Earth itself. And if this much persists in quiet entropy, what else might still be lingering, humming softly beneath the dust, waiting for us to listen? Perhaps the chair remembers the deep pressures of mountains forming, the slow grinding of tectonic plates as they pressed stone together over eons. Not because it was conscious, but because matter carries memory in its folds, in its lines, in the subtle bends and fractures no eye fully perceives. Imagine it forged from the same iron that coursed through the veins of the planet, smelted in silence as subduction swallowed oceans and spat forth continents, as volcanic breath reshaped skies and rivers carved the land with patient insistence. Maybe the weight it bears, even now, is not ours alone, but the weight of strata, of glacial ice, of sediment pressed into endless layers beneath our feet, all of it whispering through the cold steel of its frame. We might sit and feel the chair hum softly with the echo of the Earth's suffering, a vibration that predates humanity, that witnessed extinction and renewal, that felt the slow crush of rock on rock, the collapse of canyons, the shivering of soils under celestial impact. Could it be that this pulse of pressure, folded into the grain of metal, still carries the imprint of what once was alive, of forests buried under ash, of creatures pressed into fossilized silence, of civilizations whose ground has long since returned to dust? Maybe not in a way we recognize, but in the resonance of mineral and isotope, in the subtle warmth of decay, in the quiet alignment of the atoms. The chair holds this history for us to feel, if we are patient enough to listen. Consider the iron itself, slowly oxidizing, a reflection of the slow surrender of all matter to time. Not because rust consumes it, but because rust is a mirror of transformation, the same alchemy that shifts the mountains, that turns living wood into coal, that bends oceans into sediment. Each flake of corrosion is a page of memory, a record of rainfall, of wind, of temperature, of the relentless, creeping passage of ages that no human record can contain. And if the chair's weight presses upon us, perhaps it is because it carries the cumulative gravity of the earth itself, the countless strata and epochs folded into its arms and seat, a geology of suffering and endurance made tactile, intimate, and near. Maybe, if we close our eyes, we can feel the pulse beneath the metal, the slow rhythm of continents moving, of ice caps melting and refreezing, of earthquakes whispering along fault lines long dead to our maps. Perhaps the chair was not made to be sat upon, but to bear witness, to be an archive of force, of compression, of suffering encoded into matter itself, waiting for a body to remember it again. And if the earth speaks through it, softly, almost imperceptibly, then every scar, every dent, every corroded edge is a syllable in its quiet, endless story, and we are merely the listeners leaning into the faint echo of a planet still breathing beneath the weight of its own memory. And if the chair itself was once land, alive in ways we cannot name, what other fragments of the earth are hiding, quietly speaking through the objects we think we own, quietly teaching us how to feel the pulse of time? Perhaps, if we lean close, we can feel the hollow space inside the chair, not empty, but heavy with absence, a reservoir of stories that never reached the page, of breath that never became a memory. Not because names vanish easily, but because time smooths them into dust, disperses them across winds, across rivers, across the slow, indifferent erosion of stone and metal. Maybe somewhere in the isotopes of its frame, in the subtle decay of cellulose or iron, there lingers a faint echo of syllables, too delicate for the mind to catch, too quiet to survive daylight. Each dent, each worn edge, is a pause, a missing heartbeat, a gap where a life once pressed against the chair and left nothing but a faint imprint, a shadow of pressure in the fibers of history. Could it be that the chair itself remembers, not as wood or metal, but as a slow archive of suffering, folded into the molecular lattice of its being, carrying the friction of skin against restraint, the heat of sorrow turned quietly into material memory? We might imagine names whispering through its grain, syllables that could have been spoken in fear, in resignation, in the barest hope, now returning only as faint vibrations, as if the atoms themselves hum in the cadence of unrecorded voices. Maybe not one name, but a chorus of absence, each one layered atop the other like sediment in the earth, like layers of ash upon forgotten hearths, like a stratigraphy of souls slowly pressing the weight of vanished presence into the planet. Perhaps the room itself amplifies the echo, the architecture of confinement bending sound into the creases of our imagination, where dust floats slowly in shafts of wan light, where shadows become memory and memory becomes speculation. Not because we can recover the identities, but because the silence of erasure speaks more insistently than any ledger or tablet could. Maybe in that silence, in the decay, we glimpse the hollowing of time itself, the way human experience can vanish into entropy, leaving only faint pressure marks, like fossilized emotion pressed into the sediment of matter. And if we trace our fingers lightly along the curves, the edges, the indents, we are brushing against more than design. We are touching absence, the lingering shadow of names that will never be spoken again, the quiet insistence of forgotten lives that once bent over this simple object, that pressed against it and left it trembling with the residue of pain and endurance. Maybe the chair is more than furniture. Maybe it is a vessel, a carbon ghost, a slow whisper carried through centuries, asking us to listen without answering, asking us to remember without knowing, to feel without naming. And if these names, erased by time, drift quietly through the atoms around us, who else has been lost in the hollows we fail to see? Who else presses softly against the things we touch, waiting for us to notice the faint echo of a life we cannot fully imagine? And if these names, erased by time, drift quietly through the atoms around us, who else has been lost in the hollows we fail to see? Who else presses softly against the things we touch, waiting for us to notice the faint echo of a life we cannot fully imagine? Perhaps it is here, in that quiet persistence, that fear finds its own sedimentary layer, pressed like fossils into the bedrock of memory, where carbon ghosts of unease linger in the spaces between cellulose fibers and iron veins. Not because the chair is alive, but because time itself has a way of folding experience into matter, of leaving invisible impressions that refuse to dissipate. Each scratch, each warp, each subtle depression is a miniature topography of dread, a map of silent tremors frozen into the architecture of a thing that has long outlasted those who once trembled upon it. Maybe, if we allow ourselves to feel the room not with our eyes but with a slow, breathless attention, the fear becomes almost tangible, like a mist that refuses to settle, curling in quiet spirals around corners of perception, brushing along the edges of the mind, whispering the possibility of histories we cannot read. Could it be that the atoms themselves carry memory, vibrating with the aftershocks of pain, like isotopes slowly decaying while preserving the pattern of an ancient catastrophe? Not because science promises it, but because the imagination recognizes the subtle poetry in such persistence, in the way matter can store experience as much as rock stores water or ice stores air from 1,000 winters ago. We can trace this fear in the slow erosion of surfaces, in the chemical fingerprints left by prolonged stress and neglect, in the microscopic fractures that hold the echoes of pressure, of heat, of trembling hands. Maybe the chair is a silent archive, each layer a fossilized pulse of anxiety, each filament a memory of someone's skin pressed tight against anxiety that was neither seen nor named. Maybe not one human could feel the entire weight of it, but the collective imprint stretches beyond individual perception, folding fear into the geometry of the object, suspending it like amber preserves the wings of insects that flitted long before we existed. And in the quiet, when the air is thick with the suspended motes of dust, we might imagine these fossilized fears releasing the faintest quiver, a subtle rhythm that resonates only when we listen without expectation, when we sit with the stillness as though it were a companion. Maybe this is the language of erased worlds, the unspoken syntax of vanished suffering, the way entropy leaves a gentle, persistent whisper in the architecture of things. Not because the past demands acknowledgement, but because matter itself remembers, and the chair, if we dare to consider it, remembers with a patience that outlasts centuries, holding the resonance of trembling that cannot speak in words. And if fear can fossilize here, in cellulose and iron, in the shadowed corners of our own imagining, what other emotions have settled quietly into the strato of time, waiting for someone to notice the faint, trembling pulse beneath the calm surface, waiting for us to touch the edges of a history that is no longer ours, but still speaks through the weight of what remains? And if fear can fossilize here, in cellulose and iron, in the shadowed corners of our own imagining, what other emotions have settled quietly into the strato of time, waiting for someone to notice the faint, trembling pulse beneath the calm surface, waiting for us to touch the edges of a history that is no longer ours, but still speaks through the weight of what remains? Perhaps it is here that fire takes a different shape, not a flicker of oxygen and flame, not the kind that warms and consumes, but a cold flame, a persistent energy that lingers like a hum in the bones of the planet. Not because we have seen it, but because the evidence whispers in isotopes that refuse to decay as expected, in the subtle heating of stone that should have long since cooled, in the mineral lattices that seem almost alive with a resonance we cannot name. Could it be that the chair carries a physics older than our physics, a rhythm of energy preserved in loops too slow or too subtle for human perception, a law once understood but now lost in the deep erasure of centuries? Maybe, maybe not, but when we lay a hand against the smooth yet worn surface, When we trace the grain of the wood with the gentleness of someone trying not to wake a sleeping thing, there is a sensation that something does not sleep. There is a warmth, yes, but not the warmth of fire. It is a careful, measured pulse, as though the chair itself remembers the energy of all who sat, all who suffered, and translates that suffering into a faint, constant vibration that hums beneath the skin of matter. And the metals, the ancient iron that creaks ever so slightly when the light falls across it, seem to hold their own micro-labyrinth of heat, as though they were forged in a forge that never dies, a furnace lost beneath the sediment of forgotten cities and vanished civilizations. We can measure temperature, we can test conductivity, we can try to understand, but there is always a remainder, a residue of mystery that slips between instruments and human comprehension, like smoke trapped in amber or the breath of an atmosphere that no longer exists. And if we listen closely, the faintest sound may emerge, a subtle echo of perpetual energy folded into the structure of the chair, a rhythm that does not follow day or night, that is indifferent to the sun or moon, that persists where memory has faded. It is a cold flame because it does not consume, it does not destroy, it does not rise in smoke or leave ash behind. Instead, it remains, patiently, quietly, folded into every molecule as though time itself pressed the physics into permanence, and we, wandering centuries later, brush against it with unknowing hands. Could an ancient civilization have discovered how to harness such energy? Could they have built instruments to manipulate pain and heat, energy that loops eternally, preserved like a fossil of sensation? Perhaps, in some subterranean layer beneath our feet, other objects hum with similar resonance, relics of knowledge too subtle to survive history, but not subtle enough to disappear entirely. We imagine it then, the chair breathing in silence, an eternal hearth that no one tends, yet continues to flicker, not in flame but in potential, not in fire but in the delicate persistence of energy that refuses rest. Not because we can prove it, but because the world itself has a memory that science has only begun to glimpse, and matter, patient as stone and iron, keeps its secrets longer than we can measure. And if this much has lingered, what other forms of knowledge, of sensation, of ancient physics, are still waiting quietly in the shadows of our everyday world, humming softly beneath the touch of our curiosity? And as the chair hums with its cold, eternal flame, we begin to sense the larger pattern, the dialogue between matter and planet, a conversation written in the subtle language of erosion and isotopes, in the sigh of sediment pressing against stone. Not because the earth intends to speak, but because time itself acts as a slow archivist, letting gravity, wind, and water inscribe their patient stories into metal and wood alike. The iron corrodes, a slow transmutation as oxygen weaves through its lattice, as if the atmosphere itself exhales through the object, each molecule of rust a testament to invisible breaths, each flake of decay a soft whisper that centuries of human memory cannot erase. And we, leaning close, feel the rhythm of this interaction, the gentle pulse of a process older than our counting, older than the civilizations that might have once known the chair's secret, older than the stars that cast their pale light upon the surfaces of our ruined cities. Maybe the chair is nothing but dust and metal, and maybe it is more, a vessel through which the earth's breath circulates, a silent archive of entropy, reminding us that all structures, even the most precise, must return to soil, to sediment, to the slow-motion poetry of mineral and air. Could it be that the small bubbles of oxidation, the microfractures forming across the wood and iron, mirror the tectonic rhythms below our feet, the unseen subduction of continents, the slow folding of mountains that reshapes oceans without urgency? Perhaps, in this way, the chair and the earth are inseparable, both succumbing to the gentle tyranny of time, both fading without fanfare, both echoing in the quiet as the planet inhales and exhales in cycles we barely comprehend. And if we allow our thoughts to wander deeper, we might imagine that this erosion is not only physical but mnemonic, a slow deletion of history itself, the chair bleeding into the soil, the metals dissolving into mineral veins that will nourish grass and stone alike, the memory of suffering and fire carried off quietly in dust particles that drift to the corners of forgotten rooms, to riverbeds. to the skeletons of cities long abandoned. Time folds in on itself here, layering one cycle upon another, layering iron oxide upon stone, layering carbon upon sediment, until all that remains is the faint resonance of absence, a whisper of what once was, indistinguishable from the earth's own breath. And yet, the process is not cruel, not abrupt. It is deliberate, hypnotic, the slow erosion of certainty, the soft reminder that all matter participates in the same gentle decay, that everything touched by time will eventually become indistinguishable from its surroundings, returning to the rhythm of the planet that bore it. We can trace these patterns in cliffs and canyons, in fossil beds and stratigraphy, in the subtle shifts of soil chemistry that record the atmosphere of ages past. And yet when we stand before the chair, we are given a microcosm of the Earth's patience, the quiet insistence of entropy, the proof that even the smallest object carries within it the breath of the world. And if this much can fade under the slow, deliberate exhale of the planet, what else waits to vanish beneath our feet, whispering stories we are not yet ready to hear? And so we linger at the threshold of comprehension, where the edges of centuries blur like mist over a forgotten canyon, where the chair sits not merely as artifact, but as a hinge in the machinery of time itself. Not because it was crafted for immortality, but because it has endured the subtle pressures of stratigraphy, the slow folding of continents, the invisible weight of atmospheric shifts that no human memory could hope to capture. Perhaps each layer of rust and each fissure in the wood is a fossilized heartbeat, a record of the currents of energy that once passed through it, of a civilization whose rituals, now erased, brushed against the pulse of the planet like a whisper in a cavern too deep for echoes. Could it be that the chair remembers what we have forgotten, that in its unassuming stillness it carries the inertia of entire epochs, the quiet physics of worlds colliding beneath our feet while we sleep above, unaware? Maybe the people who first touched it were not unlike us, curious and tentative, yet attuned to forces we no longer recognize, forces now encoded in the isotopes that drift through the surrounding soil, in the microfractures that bend under the pressure of unseen tectonics, in the carbon ghosts that cling to its grains. We can measure decay and erosion, yes, and trace the shifting atmosphere in layers of sediment. But can we measure the memory of intention, the echo of design long misplaced in the archives of time? Not because the chair is conscious, but because the earth is, and through the slow chemistry of its elements, it preserves a shadow of thought, a faint resonance of acts we can barely name. And when we sit in its presence, we feel a pull, subtle, hypnotic, as if two currents of history brush together, one visible, the other invisible, and for a moment, the collision reverberates quietly through our awareness, soft as starlight on a canyon wall. Could it be that each era that encountered the chair misread it, saw only the surface and not the architecture of time folded within? Perhaps the fire that burns endlessly, the iron that corrodes, the whispers of memory trapped in molecules. These are not anomalies, but signatures, inscriptions of an intelligence or understanding too ancient to survive unbroken. In this shadowed intersection, where decay meets endurance, where entropy collides with persistence, the chair becomes less object than medium, less furniture than bridge, tracing a line between the vanished empires of our planet and the pale silhouettes of our own imagination. We trace its edges with our gaze, tracing the invisible collision of worlds beneath the dust, beneath the sediment, beneath the stillness of centuries that have passed without a witness. And if a single chair can carry the shadow of time in this way, what else might linger quietly, waiting for recognition, for understanding, for the faintest stir of curiosity to awaken the echoes of forgotten eras? And so we drift, quietly, into the shadowed workshop of memory itself, where the air is thick with the sediment of vanished minds, where each grain of dust carries the imprint of fingers that have long since turned to nothing, yet whose intent lingers in the curvature of a joint, the precise angle of an iron brace. Not because we see their hands, but because we see the architecture of thought pressed into matter, as if knowledge itself could solidify, leaving behind a fossil of ingenuity. Could it be that these architects, whether born of earth or elsewhere, whether flesh or something that defies naming, understood the rhythms of decay, the whispers of isotopes, the subtle erosion of time, and wove these forces into objects meant to endure far beyond human memory? Perhaps the chair is more than furniture. Perhaps it is a blueprint in 3 dimensions, a code written in the language of rust, of sedimentary alignment, of the slow folding of stone beneath the weight of continents. We trace our fingers along its edges and feel the pulse of entropy slowed, guided, harnessed, as if the decay itself were choreographed, a dance of matter and time that only they could have envisioned. Maybe their vision was of a world folded into layers we cannot see, a stratigraphy of influence that stretches from the earliest human settlements to the cities we barely recognize in the satellite's eye, from unmarked graves to the faint radio echoes of civilization now vanished. They built in silence, not because they sought secrecy, but because the earth itself was their archive, the wind their scribe, the soil their ink. Could it be that every corroded screw, every warped plank, every trace of combustion and wear carries a hidden signature, an instruction we are not yet equipped to read? Perhaps we have glimpsed the edges of their comprehension in the sudden precision of a fossil bed, in the isotope ratios that mark atmospheric shifts, in the way erosion has left patterns that mirror designs we cannot replicate. Not because we are blind, but because our senses are slow compared to the deep memory of the planet, compared to the slow, deliberate thought of creators whose era was measured in millions of years rather than decades. We imagine them at work in twilight rooms of stone and iron, their eyes reflecting chemical currents and magnetic fields, their hands shaping a logic that stretches beyond sight, beyond death, beyond memory. Maybe they moved in currents we only feel as anxiety or awe, perhaps the same currents that now brush our consciousness when we sit before the chair and sense that we are not alone in understanding its purpose. Could it be that every lost civilization, every vanished language, every entropy-crumbled city was touched by this design, and that the chair is merely the smallest, most intimate fragment of a philosophy too vast to comprehend? We listen to the silence it inhabits, to the gentle sighs of atoms shifting in alignment, to the carbon ghosts that rise like smoke from its surface, carrying whispers of intention that have outlived everything else. And if these architects have vanished, what traces remain elsewhere, waiting quietly for recognition, for the faintest stir of imagination to awaken their echo, to remind us that mastery once walked this earth and that we may yet, in our own fragile way, glimpse the dark brilliance they left behind? The metal shivers under the memory of heat, each bend and fissure a quiet testament to temperatures that once danced beyond human comprehension, as if the earth itself exhaled through flame and smoke, leaving behind a carbon whisper for those patient enough to listen. Not because the fire remained, but because the imprint of combustion is never truly gone. It lingers in the lattice of molecules, in the blackened sediment that settles like snow over forgotten cities, in the faint isotopic traces that scientists can read like letters from a vanished world. Maybe the chair was never just a chair, but a nexus of transformation, where iron and bone, wood and ash, all converged into a singular lesson written in heat, where matter surrendered its form to the subtle architecture of energy and return. Could it be that this pyre of creation and destruction was mirrored elsewhere, in volcanic plains where lava once swallowed forests whole, or in subduction zones where entire continents folded beneath each other, carrying with them the memory of life and ritual, of civilizations erased in silence? The flames do not speak, yet we sense their vocabulary in the curvature of the scorched edges, in the soft fracture lines that run like veins along metal, and in the way dust gathers there, patiently, like sediment in an ancient riverbed, preserving the faint pulse of vanished heat. We imagine the air trembling above the fire, carrying the scent of resin and wood, of metals melting into themselves, a scent that lingers even after centuries have passed, clinging to the stone and soil, the same soil that now cradles our feet. Not because we can smell it now, but because the earth remembers, and its memory is a slow, patient thing, folding layers upon layers of events into strata we barely comprehend, recording not only the elements but the echoes of intent, the silent ritual of shaping, burning, and yielding to forces larger than our own. Maybe somewhere in that sediment, The ashes of a world forgotten lie intertwined with pollen, with soot, with microfossils, carrying the rhythm of a day when fire was not merely destruction, but a language, a ceremony, a transition between eras we cannot yet name. Could it be that when we peer into these traces, when we brush dust from a scorched corner, we are listening to a conversation across millennia, where heat, decay, and rebirth are the words, and silence is the voice? And in the soft glow of imagination, we see the chair not as cruelty alone, but as witness, as record, as bridge, and the flames as archivists, etching stories into the air and stone, stories that fold back into the earth itself, stories that speak to the slow erosion of memory, to civilizations folded like paper in the layers of sediment, to rituals that vanished with smoke and carbon. Perhaps every ember that once licked its surface carries a fragment of what was, a pulse of worlds lost to time, a rhythm of transformation that continues quietly beneath our feet. Maybe the echoes are never truly gone. Maybe they linger in the whisper of wind through hollowed ruins, in the shimmer of heat over blackened plains, in the patient turning of dust to soil, waiting for us to hear them again, waiting for us to imagine the fire and the world it consumed. And if these ashes speak at all, what might they tell us about the worlds we are yet to see? And so the chair surrenders to silence, its edges curling inward, metal softening like wax beneath an unseen sun, each contour a slow exhale of centuries. Not because it once held weight, but because it holds absence, the absence of what will be lost, the absence of stories not yet remembered, the absence that stretches beyond the reach of any human chronicle. Dust settles upon it like snow on a grave no one visits, each particle a miniature archive, a sediment of vanished heat, vanished hands, vanished thought, and in its quiet accumulation, we sense the pulse of time itself slowing, bending, folding over itself. Maybe, maybe not. The chair was never a tool at all, but a witness, a recorder, a phantom ledger of the world's gradual disappearance, its whispers carried into the soil, into the isotopes trapped within eroding rock, into the strata that will one day be read by beings who have forgotten the language of their own creators. What if every crack in the metal is a map, not of past events, but of future erasure, a topography of fading, where civilizations are layered like sediment and then unlayered, returned to elemental dust? We imagine the wind tracing the chair's contours, carrying microscopic shards of memory into corners where nothing else survives, brushing against fossils embedded in stone, where once living matter folded into mineral, preserving gestures and glances in the language of decay. Not because we can touch them now, but because the earth does not forget quickly. It archives in slow pulses, in the sediment of rivers, the slow compression of glaciers, the grinding of tectonic plates against each other, pressing away what was and leaving only traces faint enough that we might mistake them for coincidence. Could it be that memory is a kind of sediment too, layering upon itself, and that in a future untouched by human intention, all will flatten, all will blur, and nothing will be recognizable except as suggestion, as echo, as the soft vibration of entropy in motion? The chair rusts further, and in its decay, we see a meditation on impermanence, the hollowing of wood, the gentle flaking of metal, the way shadows gather in its joints, in its hollows, in the places where a hand or a body once pressed, now only air, only absence. And if memory itself can dissolve like this, what of the languages we speak, the structures we build, the ideas we cradle as eternal? Perhaps they too are destined to return to dust, to whisper only faintly in isotopes, in fossilized pollen, in the slow layering of carbon across continents. And maybe this chair, this relic of fire and form, is giving us the faintest prelude, a requiem for all things not yet gone, a quiet invitation to listen to the spaces between what was and what will never be. And if this much can vanish, what else are we already forgetting? And so, we are left in the stillness, not because it is empty, but because it is full of what once was. The chair, now silent and worn, holds its secret not in the absence of heat, but in the persistence of it, like a memory that refuses to fade, still alive in the very air that surrounds it. The rust, the eroded edges, the soft flaking of metal, These are not merely signs of decay, but echoes of fire, of something once fierce and consuming, now buried beneath layers of time. Could it be that the fire, though it no longer dances upon the metal, still burns beneath its surface, hidden in the very atoms that once surrendered to its heat? Maybe, maybe not. But the chair itself seems to carry the trace of that ancient energy, like a faint pulse beneath the stillness, a whisper that speaks not of flames, but of something more enduring, more eternal. We lean closer, not to hear the crackle of flame, but to feel the heat that lingers in the chair's bones. Not because we can touch it, but because we sense it, as though the chair is not merely an object, but a vessel of time, carrying with it the warmth of all it once held. Could it be that the fire within it, a fire that once consumed flesh and memory, still lingers in the silent depths, like the smoldering remains of an ancient ritual, a fire that has not died, but simply become something else, something subtler, something quieter? Maybe it is not the flame that defines the chair, but the imprint of the flame, like the shape of a life pressed into earth, forever remembered in the patterns left behind. Perhaps this is the eternal question. What remains when everything else is past? The fire no longer burns, but its presence lingers like a ghost, haunting the space around the chair, leaving traces in the air, in the dust that gathers upon its surface, in the shifting isotopes of time. What do we truly understand about the things we lose? What if the flame that once scorched is not gone at all, but merely transformed, dispersed, scattering across the planet like the winds that have carried its warmth across the ages? And in this quiet, in this fading, does the earth keep the memory of it, tucked away beneath the surface, in the very molecules of the air we breathe, in the subtle energy that remains? We cannot see the fire, not now, but we can feel it, perhaps not as heat, but as presence. And if we dare to look deeper, into the ashes, into the layers of time that have settled upon it like dust, what might we find? Maybe not answers, but more questions, more whispers from a world that has long since turned to silence. And if this flame never truly went out, what else is quietly burning beneath the surface of time, waiting for us to discover it, to look deeper, to listen more carefully?